Excellent. Righto. Righto. Good morning, everybody. Good turnout. So I'm just going to do a quick 30-second introduction, just with a little bit of housekeeping, I guess. So Chris has obviously chosen a topic that's pretty topical as we speak. So he's got some good content to share there. I guess the one thing is, as you get questions or as questions come up across the session, I'm just going to moderate through the chat facility there in the background. So we've got everybody muted out just to make that easier. But if you've got any questions, just there's a chat session there, and just make sure that's public if you would, and I'll pick those up and let Chris know that they're there when they're ready to go. So I'll hand straight over to Chris.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome all. Just looking through a quick look through who's online. Yeah, the challenge is really ahead of me, I suppose, because it is a national perspective and things are different for different people in different states, and even within different states of Australia or geographic localities, there's going to be quite a bit of variability. And given the way nitrogen reacts with weather, soil and management, you know, we're starting from some very different places, different locations and amounts of nitrogen that's indicated for availability of the season. It's quite wide this year, and as the information Chris has put in front of you, we've had numbers as high as 400 kilograms of mineral nitrogen detected through soil tests, and that makes you scratch your head how that might have happened. But when you go back, and as I've done with the people that have rung in with that sort of thing, we've gone through the history of what's been applied, what's been grown, what's been removed, and funny enough, we can account for all but about 20% of it. In some cases, we're higher, and I don't count that as being too bad for a back of the envelope to guess about why there is that much nitrogen there. So, the nitrogen cycle, with all its mysteries, is still the nitrogen cycle. As long as we can stop it at a point in time and assign values to what's happened to it over time, we can make a pretty fair fist of what the heck's going on. So I suppose what I should do is share my screen. Okay. We'll see how that goes. Chris, you seeing my screen now?
Not as yet, but I just turned off stop share from my side. So whether
okay,
you need that too. If that fails, we'll just go back to what we've done before, and I'll make you the host. Not seeing it as yet.
Yeah. Let me see. Share that screen. Share.
Yep, got something coming online now. Good to go, Chris.
Right, I'll just change to the right screen. Okay, that's the right one for the time being. Yep. Okay, so this is just a general chat from me and some feelings about what's happened and what's happening and what technology's out there and how it's relevant and fitting it into nitrogen management in 2020. As I said, right from the start, we've got very variable conditions from indications of soil profiles with very little mineral nitrogen in it, right through to some where we've got up to 400 kilograms. That's about the maximum I've seen. So that takes very, very different requirement for management. Fortunately, it seems to be related to productivity of crops in previous years. So we're not getting paddocks side by side that have none and some that have got 400. It's more likely that we see some that have got very little, 20 to 80 kilograms of N in the profile as mineral nitrogen. And at other locations, it might vary from 100 to 150 through to 300 kilograms. And I think that just reflects the productivity over the past 3 or 4 years, and some degree the optimism and cash flow that's been available to farmers to try and grow the best crop they can in previous years, which hasn't really come off. And as we know, nitrogen in a drought is a residual nutrient. So it has accumulated, and it's accumulated in amounts that can be justified if you go back and look at the inputs and outputs of the system. So that's really, what we're doing is nitrogen in the past was probably a set and forget type nutrient. More and more across more and more locations, it becomes something that we plan at the beginning of the year. And as we do with other things when we're growing the crop, we go into an active management phase that I'll describe the way that I think about it in 5 different phases across the year, and what your options might be depending on some of the factors that are available to you to modify it in season. So the state of play at the moment for 2020, as I look at it, and there might be other people that can add information to this on a local basis, and please do if you think it needs to be covered. There's large areas of Australia that have had less than average production over a period of time. We all know about the drought situation. And by and large, I'm not sure that anything's changed too much in some locations. Yes, we've got a green pick on the top and we've got some subsoil moisture, but certainly we don't necessarily have enough that you would say that we're out of the woods as far as a couple of years of profitable cropping ahead of us. As a result of either the failure of crops or the lack of planting of crops, we've probably got a lower level of preceding pulse crops than in previous seasons, which is obviously going to affect the nitrogen economy. Either way, it may be that they just failed at a point to produce a lot of grain but had reasonable dry matter, in which case it's probably a net positive. And there's been a couple of cases where I have looked at some situations of very large accumulations of nitrogen, and you can see nearly every case where there's been a pulse crop in there that has grown reasonable dry matter early, only to have a terminal drought, and really didn't harvest anything or was abandoned. In other words, all the nitrogen that was fixed in that crop actually ended up back in the soil post-harvest and is now showing up in the soil mineral pool. For those that are in pasture rotations, again, poor production and probably even poorer production out of the legume component of those pastures in the last couple of years. So that those are coming out of pasture, probably not as productive as that would have been had the previous couple of years been crackers for legume production in spring. So those things have led to high soil mineral nitrogen tested after the autumn rains in some areas. So if you go back and look at some people that tested early before we got, after the hot summer and very little rainfall, net input of water that would drive mineralisation, there wasn't a lot looking like being there, but certainly the rainfall in late February and into March in a lot of areas stimulated a huge round of mineralisation, and I suspect we've probably got up around the 1, 2, 3 kilograms a day for the duration that the topsoil has been, the top 30 centimetres has been wet. So, there was some very, very rapid mineralisation, which again showed up very, very clearly. In other areas, that have missed out on those sort of rains, then things might be a little bit so-so as a result. But it's with organic matter. If you don't mineralise it now, it will mineralise at a later date. And that being the case, then, it's probably an in-crop if we get decent spring rainfall. The other thing that is noticeable is just the variability in the distribution of the mineral N that's coming back through soil testing. And a lot of it's dependent on net summer moisture over summer. So there's, have we had follow-up rain to take it down deeper into the profile? or is it sitting just in the surface, in which case just where it is in the profile will have some question marks about what our actual nitrogen strategy is as far as placement and timing. So, you know, you can get a lot about not only how much is there, but where is it, depending on the environment you're trying to grow the crop. And very largely that'll depend on your confidence in getting rainfall during the stage of late tillering through to flag leaf, as far as an in-crop application and the benefits that that might have to the system, or is that too big a risk and you need to do something about it earlier? And I'll talk a bit later about that. So I find starting simple and getting more complex as we understand more about the system we're dealing with is the best way to deal with nitrogen. It's a complex enough equation to begin with, but if we start with the complex and try and work backwards, we'll only miss something. So as I said, we're dealing with the same old nitrogen cycle. We are still learning, and this is basically the nitrogen budget circa 1996 overlaid over it. And what we know about the nitrogen cycle, or we knew, and the way we do nitrogen budgets, if you'd use that as a tool to check your likely requirement for nitrogen, is we generally provide a nitrogen efficiency around 40 to 50%. In other words, when people calculate the nitrogen removal, they estimate the crop demand as around 40 to 50%. So they multiply the removal by 2 to 2.5 to come up with the crop demand. Now, what that does, and that's really the crop demand being what we need in the soil for the plant to actually build the building blocks of the actual crop canopy, the roots, the stems, leave a bit behind and lose a bit. That efficiency is not, the rest is lost. In fact, the efficiency is generally, the actual uptake efficiency is quite a bit higher than that. But the overall efficiency of the system from soil to grain frequently lands in that sort of range. Now, what that does is, I don't know whether you've realised, but frequently we just measure that efficiency and use only the nitrate and ammonium pool, the mineral end pool, in measurements to say that's what the supply is. But in reality, what's taken into account in this efficiency is the fertiliser efficiency, what I will call the labile organic N, which is basically the crop residues of the previous 3 years and what they might contribute. And then there's the organic humic fraction, which is the old humic material that makes up the majority of the organic matter in the soil that releases at a slow rate at a very big pool. So really what we're talking about in a nitrogen situation is around a 40 to 50% of it getting from the soil through the plant and into the grain. Now, what I've said over the side here is that's okay for planning. That's not a bad starting point. It's easy to do. You can do the numbers in your head by matching what the yield and protein requirement are up here to what the soil can supply. And we're saying it needs about twice as much as the plant requires in the grain. And if we can't supply that, we just use the difference as fertiliser, or we apply the difference as fertiliser. And really what that is saying is, as a planning tool, it's okay. You could do better with more complex systems, yes. And it's not bad at saying, do I need none, some, a bit more, or a lot? In other words, I would say this system as a planning tool, if we're doing this 4 months before we really know what the weather's going to do and what the final soil moisture is going to be, and we're taking a guess around what the yield's going to be, If we're within 20 kilograms of what's required in a higher productive area and within 10 in some of the drier areas with lower yield potential, then as a planting tool, it's not bad to get you on the ballpark about how much nitrogen you're going to need on the farm and do the costing of farm inputs. As an active management tool from there on, it's pretty poor, because what really runs the response in the crop is the relative contributions of the labile, the humic, the nitrate and the fertilizer, and they don't all work at 50%. So one of the ways, and sort of something we're exploring, is whether there is any benefit in actually using what we know now, and as a result of a lot of the nitrogen research on nitrogen loss, denitrification, volatilization, has also provided some insights into how these pools actually work. And what we know from that research is those organic N pools, particularly the labile pools, after planting, and I'll preface this by saying after sowing, because before sowing, really what they contribute is part of the mineral nitrogen pool. So after sowing, if they're dribbling out nitrogen in response to rainfall and temperature events, then they're highly efficient in as far as uptake, because there's two things happening. They're being liberated in the topsoil, because most of this material is in the top 30 centimeters of the soil. That's where we have our active root system. So in crop, if we're getting a slow dribble of nitrogen out in a crop zone that is being dried down by the crop roots and intercepted, then the chance of denitrification and volatilization and runoff is minimized. So we end up with some very high efficiencies of nutrient of that type. The same with the humic N. We have good evidence that if you take into account just the release of the stuff post-planting, not if we include, and a lot of studies that you see around legume contributions are lower than this. They're 20 to 60%. But that takes into account some of that nitrogen that has actually gone across here before, it's a whole season view rather than just an in-crop view. So, this can be 60 to 90% in crop. We now know that this is not just 50%, it can vary, and it's generally on the higher side, particularly where it's well distributed down the profile. So again, Richard Daniels' work suggests that, we do get stranding of nitrogen up the top, and that contributes to this 30%. But if we know the location is below 30 centimeters, then it's more likely to be up to 60% in. So knowing the location and the amount and the efficiency that we're looking at to modify the efficiency, then we can get a better idea of what that's going to contribute. The last part of the puzzle is the fertilizer side of things. And again, in Northern Australia, and I think Roger Armstrong's work in Southern Australia would suggest the same, that from pre-plant applications of fertilizer or fertilizer early in crop or at sowing, we are generally on the bottom end of this as far as efficiency. So it's only 20%. Once we come to well-structured in-crop programs, then we're probably heading north of 50 to 60% efficiency. So if you combine those, one of the challenges, I suppose, is in the previous view where we were using just an effective 50%, if we go to this view, it better caters for the situation where we have a huge bias coming from one or other of these pools. In the previous view, everything was treated at 40 to 50, but in a situation where you've got 200 kilograms of nitrate in here at 30 to 60% versus 200 kilograms of fertilizer, and that's going to affect the fertilizer rate quite significantly, particularly if it's well distributed. So 200 kilograms at 60% is 120 kilograms of uptake. 120 kilograms of N applied just prior to sowing at 20% efficiency means only going to get 24 kilograms of that nitrogen in. So they are not equal. So once we start to understand huge biases, either low or high in these pools, it starts to affect that average efficiency. The other one that's starting to appear is the uptake efficiency. So once we get it into the roots, it doesn't matter from which source, but because by then the roots don't care where it's come from. But the plant does transfer nitrogen through the plant to grain at different efficiencies. In drought years, things like terminal drought, and we tend to be on the bottom side, so we get haying off. We've got a big biomass of nitrogen in the crop, but not much ends up in the grain. At the other end, when we tend to grow things on the lean side, then we can have efficiencies of transfer of the plant uptake nitrogen through the grain as high as 90%. One of the interesting developments for the future is what's the varietal effect of this? And you've got things, there's questions over, the classic one in Eastern Australia was the discussion about EGA Gregory versus Spitfire. How the heck, given planted at similar times with similar soil moisture, did we end up with such a variance in the way that those two varieties petitioned nitrogen? I'm not sure I've got the answer, but they do something different, and Gregory just had this ability, and I imagine it was a trait that's now through all of the progeny that are coming out of Gregory are probably the same, but they seem to be very good at petitioning growing yield and petitioning nitrogen differently to Spitfire. So watch this space. And so, when we decide to do, a nitrogen budget for the future, we could use this approach in planning if we've got better and realistic understanding of what these numbers are. Otherwise, it's just going to make silly numbers. If you're too far wrong with this, you are a lot worse off than doing it the old way. But if you've got really good numbers and understand the system and what the levers are to be able to say, this is 20% or 60%, or this is 30 or 60, then we're going to get close to the real number. The other thing that this approach does open up is better as a tool in the active management phase. So as we better understand the pool contributions as the season refines itself, also as we get closer to the season and moving through the season, you can rerun this with the numbers and update what the nitrogen requirement might be. So yes, the old nitrogen cycle hasn't changed. It still works the same way, but I think we now, in the last 5 years, are gaining a better perspective on how it's working and how to hone this down to be a lot more relevant in localities other than just based on yield and protein outcomes. Just a little bit of proof of the types of data that we now have. This is some stuff from Mark Peoples and Anthony Swan from CSIRO. And this is the relationship between soil mineral nitrogen and wheat N uptake. This is the 100% line. In other words, 100 kilograms of mineral nitrogen saw 100 kilograms of uptake. Now, given that this was after a range of legumes and non-legumes, you can see there's some divergence. With the legumes, I've drawn this red line in here, and you can probably offset that line to show that the legumes are producing or for a certain amount of mineral nitrogen at sowing, the legumes are producing a bit more in crop, because if you look at where that line intersects, if it was parallel, then it's saying there's probably another 30 or 40 kilograms of nitrogen becoming available to the crop for uptake in addition. But also what it's saying is, the pre-soil mineral nitrogen is not the only thing that's contributing to uptake. The efficiencies of the stuff that's coming in crop is probably higher than the mineral nitrogen alone. And that's what sort of that's what we suspect. That's not the only study, but it's Mike Bell in the north has shown some studies in the zero plots. So if you go back and look at zero N plots in research experiments, the nitrogen there, mineral nitrogen there, compared to what's in the grain at harvest with no other nitrogen applied, is frequently in this sort of realm as far as uptake's concerned. So the other part of the equation is what's happening to the inherent nitrogen supply of the crop. So we've measured the mineral nitrogen, which is what's present this season, but what else can we rely on? And I look back and you talk to some of, just remembering some of the conversations when I started as a young agronomist. There was still a lot of land in Queensland that had only been broken up, particularly in the western areas, for a number of years, 10 years. And farmers commonly would talk about the need to take the sting out of the land. You couldn't grow wheat, particularly the old tall varieties in the 1970s, because they fell over. There was too much nitrogen, they grew too tall, and they fell over. So they used to take the sting out of the ground with oats for 3 or 4 years, so that they had enough nitrogen to get a wheat crop through to harvest without it falling over. Now that just tells you the inherent nitrogen fertility of those soils. They grew massive amounts. And that relates to this graph of soil organic carbon. As we know, there's there is quite a strong relationship between organic carbon in the soil and the nitrogen content, particularly in the organic fractions. So in the old days, organic carbon's 2.5%. There's still places in Australia in the southern high rainfall southern zone that they're twice that, and it gives you an idea of the potential. But probably so too are the yields that we're producing compared to these soils in their native state. But up at this end, in a good season, you didn't have to do anything. The soils actually looked after themselves and looked after the crop. So as yield potential increased, the soil increasingly released more nitrogen because there's more rainfall, and the yield potential increased. The grain protein kept pace, and the increased soil residual N in some seasons. So it wasn't uncommon to have high production and no response to nitrogen. And basically, the Darling Downs and such regions got reputations of being high fertility and never running out of nutrient on the basis of this sort of reaction. But as we know, things have changed, and a lot of those soils are down around 30% of their original organic carbon, and largely they're down to probably 30, 40 less percent of their supply power. So what I call this is just a loss of yield and protein plasticity. And what that is the lack of ability when the season changes for the actual soil to react and produce more nitrogen in line with the moisture. In other words, what's happened is the soils just don't react the same way they did in the past, and it now throws the onus to take care of that better situation, seasonal situation. It throws the onus on the actual advisor or the farmer to react. And that can be difficult because we might get a signal, 1 month out that we've got a decile act season, and by 3 months away, that's changed. It's nice to have the soil in a condition where it can react to that. Now, I think largely farming practices are moving towards trying to restore this plasticity. It takes risk out of farming, or it reduces risk around nitrogen decisions greatly if you can have the soil respond. And we are seeing movements towards this. This sort of first cropped and after, first crop after legume pasture phase, yeah, we can try and rebuild this if we change the farming practice. But people that are in long-term cropping, unless you can find some way of making money out of a legume-based pasture, then we're stuck with other things to try and restore this plasticity. And in a lot of cases, this is now. Decisions around nitrogen are big decisions because, one, they are risky and in a lot of environments, and they can be costly. So the options, what do we do? Build labile and humic fraction through, say, lay pasture. We do see the rise of mixed farming in the appropriate regions. And is that going to continue? I suppose it comes down to a fact of are we making good money out of lay pastures? You just have to say people that are good at livestock are certainly doing that. And in the future, if that's not quite as attractive, are the benefits in that plasticity of the soil for cropping enterprises, is that enough when livestock aren't quite as attractive? The other one is to build not as effective, and it's not as a lot more short term, but building labile fraction through increased pulse frequency possibility. Probably in concert with use of nitrogen rates that are sustainable across time. Recognizing and using more soil nitrogen more efficiently. How much is enough? Recognizing we've got seasons where we may not need to replace the mineral pool. I'm not sure that when you've got 300 kilograms there, you'll use as much as you can, but putting on another 80 in that situation because you want to put a maintenance rate on, I'm not sure that that's a good idea in that situation. And just determining at what point mineral nitrogen needs to be topped up as a long-term maintenance of the soil mineral pool as a management strategy, probably need to refine that a bit. And the other one is to play around with the risk side of things, and through the 4 R's, you play when we're talking about fertilizer nitrogen, but basically your strategy for using that. Next stage we get to, and next concept is, once we fix the nitrogen supply by saying the system has as much as it's going to get, then at that stage, we need to recognise we are at the mercy as far as our yield and protein outcome in crops where protein is important, at the mercy of what happens to the water after that stage that we fix things. Because the water drives the yield. To a degree, it will tickle up the nitrogen in those organic pools. But from that point on, we've applied amount of nitrogen against a thought of what the water limited yield is. And if things change from a water point of view, we're going to get either a decrease in yield and an increase in protein, or an increase in yield and a decrease in protein, depending on the outcome. So by and large, this is a diagram of just a particular dilution curve and the relationship to some decile outcomes as to what might happen for a fixed nitrogen supply. So, the expected or the target grain protein was 11.5%, and we were looking at what happens. This blue line is what would happen if the moisture changed. So if we changed to a decile, sorry, this was for a situation where for a decile 8, if we look at the intersection here, instead of ending up with 2.5 tonnes at 11, or 2.6 tonnes at 11.5%, which is what we were targeting, we'd probably more likely, with just the nitrogen supply fixed, we'd sacrifice protein and we'd end up with more likely around the 3.2 tonnes, the intersection with here, and down here at about 10%. Now you can say, well, that's a good outcome. I'm happy with that. If that was the case, the in-season decision would be, okay, well, you know, I'm not going to risk it. Decile 8 season, can't do better than that. If I put more nitrogen on, really, I'm just going to play in a bit more protein. Is that worth it? Going the other direction, though, is if, you know, this is your yield potential at lower deciles, you can see that we're just going to stack on protein that really, you know, above 13%, we're probably not going to get paid for. So, you know, we've got enough nitrogen on there to produce generally what you would call pH in wheat and durum wheat, as long as our yields potential doesn't drop below 2.5 tonnes. Or when it drops below 2.5 tonnes. Above there, we're in the AH section, and then we're, you know, right through, and we're starting to drop protein down here into levels of GP, you know, and such grades. So, you know, it really comes down to what you want to do with the wheat. But knowing this is what's likely to happen if the nitrogen supply is fixed and still available, and moisture changes, it's nice to know what the likely outcomes would be to help make decisions about the future. So for me, as far as crop nitrogen decisions, I have 5 stages that I usually go through in my mind across the season. Look at some decision variables and look at the tools I would look at to try and help me make decisions. So those decision stages are fallow, crop establishment, Z14 instead of 4-leaf through to head initiation through to anthesis, anthesis through, through to flag leaf, and flag leaf through to anthesis. So in making these decisions, there's a lot about which region am I in and what are my options, particularly around later applications if I'm not going to put it in by the time I establish the crop. So for locations that are drier in spring and have high risks of not getting up significant follow-up rains for strategically placed nitrogen, particularly during the Z30 to 37 stage, then these 2 options have got to be seriously weighed up. So, you know, at fallow, you know, is pre-plant N required or not? And if so, what sort of rate? As I said, plus or minus 20 kilograms might be required. At this stage, we can top up at crop establishment, or we may be able to, depending on the equipment that's available and all the products we might choose to use at crop establishment. But the risk variable, the decision variables here are risk of later application options and the yield potential. So if the risk's too high and the yield potential's too low, why bother try and put it on later? You may as well get it up front. And, you know, there's good evidence from some of the work that's been done earlier that number sort of seems to sit around in the southern areas. Yields are around the 2.5 to 3 tonne plus average long term. Is about the tipping point where pre-plant nitrogen and post-plant nitrogen start to make sense. So up to the 5 tonne end, it makes sense to probably use some or all of the nitrogen in crop, and anything less than, say, 2.5 tonnes in those environments, you're having a risk of not getting follow-up rain sufficient to maximise compared to pre-plant or at sowing nitrogen. So some of the tools I look at, things like previous grain protein that was produced particularly if the previous crop was a cereal, and soil analysis then, so mineral nitrogen, soil water stored, and seasonal forecasts. So these sort of are the sorts of things that I'm looking for to give me a cue on how much and possibly when you might put it on. Crop establishment, usually for a small top up to the fallow. If things change, you decide to go early in the fallow, and things change, there's an opportunity for a small uptake, a small top up, or there's a situation where you recognise you've done a segmented soil profile and there may be nothing down to 60 centimetres, and really very low numbers down to 60 centimetres, and a reasonable amount below there. You may want to top up some N to get you through the Z14 to Z30 stage. Generally, make sure that you don't compromise tillering, which can happen if nitrogen goes too low early in the season. So as long as we've got tillering, the nitrogen in the plant, it can be yellow, but if we're not restricting the number of tillers, then we've got a chance to resurrect it later. And I suppose a tool over here, in addition to these, is the safe N rate calculator, just to make sure that what we end up doing, particularly if any of the fertilizer is going with the seed, then we have a margin of, or the risk calculated of what that might mean on crop establishment. Next stage, 14 to 30. This is what we would call the vegetative stage. And really a decision in here to apply nitrogen is about stimulating tillering. It's lagging. We don't have the tiller numbers. We have the moisture, and we need some more tillers to make sure that we reach enough tillers so that when we get into the main uptake phase, which is post Z30, that we've got enough tillers to give us enough heads, and then all we have to do is worry about the head size and the grain number and grain size. So at this stage, what we're doing, and obviously we've got to think about application options. Can we get in and do something in here, and what the weather might be to actually incorporate the nitrogen. Tiller counts, obviously, plant tissue N, green normal differential vegetative index, NDVI, red edge. There's a whole heap of other things coming along that we can start to use once we've got adequate ground cover, either proximal sense or remote sensed. But ultimately, a lot of these things, these remote and proximal sense, I think people are to the stage now they're comfortable to start using them, but would be even better to be able to ground truth at a couple of places in the paddock, the decisions based on plant tissue analysis to confirm what these are saying. And obviously they give you a better spatial representation of what might be what's happening in the plant tissue than just a random sample that you might line up with a soil analysis. Next stage, which is the most important one in any crop, cereal crop, is Z30 to 37. This is the stage when about 60% of the nitrogen uptake actually takes place. And in highly productive rainfall or high production areas, those with yield potentials of 4 to 7 tonne area, the most recent publication said as long as you've got enough tillering in here, you can have the nitrogen deficiency in the crop up until Z30, nearly as severe as you like, as long as tillering's not affected, and recover every bit of yield during this phase. A little bit of a worry if you don't have a good option for increasing nitrogen supply in crop, but certainly in the high rainfall zones, then nitrogen in the vegetative stage up to Z30, if you've got options in crop, is irrelevant. The actual plant tissue current critical levels are not a good gauge for what to do at that stage in those environments. So Z30 to 37, most critical phase for management. If you can't do anything in that stage as far as application, well, you've got to do it before then. But if you do have good options, then what you're doing is supporting the yield potential as it goes through this stage, and supporting the protein target as the yield potential changes. So the decision variables become what's the yield potential, what's the protein target, and what application options do I have? Is it 1? Is it 2? Those are the variables that you're trying to make decisions about. At this stage, we're starting to get very strong signals. The other thing that's sort of coming out in the literature is some of these indices are not real good, and particularly in those high rainfall environments. in predicting the nitrogen requirement later. So as you can imagine, as I said, if you've got the right number of tillers, then the colour of the crop has no reflection on what the potential is for nitrogen for the future. But it would seem as we get into this Z30 to 37, then this is when a lot of these GNDVI and NDVI red edge, those things start to come into their own about making decisions around what the application strategy should be. So this is the important stage, and then the last stage is flag leaf through to probably anthesis or just after, where what you can do is target protein and get minor yield enhancement. But this is a risky phase. The uptake efficiency can be very poor, but if there was sufficient I suppose merit in the protein premiums, and the season was going with you, then people have been able to make that work. But it's been very rare, but it is another window to affect nitrogen. So, understanding the decision points, the tools, it shows you that the nitrogen management is now not a destination, it's a journey. And as we get along the journey, certain tracks close down because we don't have information that's reliable, or we don't have application options, or we don't have weather opportunities to make the best of it. So, for some people in low rainfall areas that particularly have spring droughts, we don't have a lot other than fallow and crop establishment. But there are seasons, and you might say, well, the Bureau of Met saying decile 8 this season for some of those regions. Do we start to look at some of these options? In other areas, the higher rainfall zones in southern Australia, these are just normal strategies. So they tend to ignore what's in the fallow crop establishment. May have a quick look at what's happening in this stage, but really the concentration of nitrogen management is during Z30 to 37. Tracking yield potential, some new tools coming available. I just wanted to put this up and just show you one that's sort of come to be available this season, and it's something I'm going to be tracking. This one's from Graincast. It's a CSIRO product. And what it does is just tells you based on, I suppose, simulated runs for rainfall runs and for soils and locations. It gives you a forecast, and it updates every 3 days what the soil moisture is and what the yield potential is. And of course, as the season progresses, it tightens up because the unknown weather's gone, and the known weather is a larger part of what creates the yield potential, and the unknown bit becomes smaller. So what I've done is run here a simulation for southern Australia. This is based around Temora, just east of north of Canberra, sort of that area. And you can see currently for the paddock I selected, it's running about 99% of capacity, 125 mils of water for a wheat crop. Which is the exact opposite of what you'd expect, because this one's northern Australia, and you can see this one's got 155 mils of capacity. This is based just north of Moree, and it's only half full, which is probably realistic. But it's giving a yield range at this stage that's huge, and you'd say, what the heck's the use of that? Well, this darker part over here is really the colour scale is giving you the confidence of what might likely happen given the current rainfall forecast, which is decile 8. So in this case, it's saying the confidence is low because this is a in-crop rainfall driven yield area. But if it's a decile 8 came along, then between 6 and 7 tonne is probably the most likely outcome for that area with no other limitation. Whereas over here in the north, currently it's got a better confidence. You can see that's really weird, a higher yield but a lower confidence. This is because it hasn't had the in-crop rainfall. This area yields largely based on stored soil moisture. It's giving you a larger range, but the confidence is medium. It's better than over here because stored soil moisture is better than a forecast of what's likely to happen in the future. But on that basis, you can see the most likely outcome for the rainfall decile going out from here is a yield confidence of about 3/4 of a tonne through to 1.5 tonnes per hectare. So, you know, in this particular field that doesn't have full moisture, you know, it's a bit dodgy unless we really do improve the rainfall, which again, this will update as the Bureau of Met updates. It'll start to move this in one direction or another. So this will close down and this will move. Now, I think it's a really simple tool to help us understand what's going on with yield, to help manage our nitrogen decisions. So I talked about soil mineral nitrogen, and our strategies around in crop, if we decide to put none on, will probably depend on where it is, not only how much. And you can see here's 3 profiles that I've drawn. Funny enough, if you look at the amount of nitrogen that's available to 120 centimetres, they're all 200. In other words, all of those profiles have 200 kilograms of nitrogen contained in them down to 1.20 meters. But they are very different shapes, and I can tell you crops will probably respond to them in very different manners. And that's based on, if we start to look at very shortly after germination, most crops will have access to probably 20 to 30 centimetres of moisture. So in this profile, there's 106 kilograms of N to 30 centimetres. In this one, there's 45. In this one's 20. Now, you know, knowing that gives you some ideas of the potential for needing to do something in that reproductive phase. So in the vegetative stage, if we choose to put no nitrogen on pre-plant, what we can expect is this will go crazy. It'll tiller like mad, and it may in fact over tiller and go crazy. This one will probably do something different. This one, if we actually end up with wetting and drying of just the top 30 or 40 centimetres and no root proliferation below there, if there's no moisture below there, we could end up with a crop that's showing inhibited tillering, because it's only got 20 kilograms, and up to about Z30, the crop needs to accumulate for a reasonable yield 20 to 60 kilograms of nitrogen by the start of Z30. So this one, you know, although there's 200 kilos there, it may display under certain conditions a different response to this profile. So what post-sowing assessment options do we have? I'd say, you know, we can do an in-crop end budget, we can do plant testing, or we can do remote sensing, or we can do the whole lot if we've got time and the decision is a little bit unclear and we need all of them to line up. So there's lots of options. Which ones you select, you know, what we're talking basically post, you know, May, June, July, August, September, generally the decision months. You can see there's a whole heap of things. We can do tiller counts. We can look for nutrient deficiency symptoms. We can do, you know, plant tissues of whole tops. We can do plant tissues of youngest expanded blades. We can do in-crop deep NNS. We can do flag leaf N, or we can do remote or proximal sensing. As I said, we can do all of them. So what are the critical things in doing those? One is to understand what's the plant doing and when. Because some of these things are just plain nonsense if you don't either sample the right part or sample it at the right time. So one of the things that is really important to understand is where are the roots and how much of them are there at different plant phenological stages. Now this will be modified by if there is a dry layer in the soil and we are getting wetting and drying events regularly, because that will modify this. But by and large, if we start out with a reasonably moist profile, the critical stages are in the vegetative stage. Root depth is generally 60 to 70% of its maximum as defined by any subsoil constraint. The other thing is that the root's mass will generally only be about 30% of the total root mass that will be available at the end of the crop. In other words, plants are smart. They grow deep before they grow densely. And that's to make sure they've established themselves to find nutrient and water to whatever depth, and then they thicken up towards as we go through this late tillering and through to the early reproductive phase. The uptake, the interesting thing is the uptake of nitrogen is only about 20 to 30% of the total by that stage. So we've got root depth, we've got not much root density, and we haven't got a lot of the nitrogen taken up by then. From there through to anthesis is where the majority of things happen. So the root mass up until flag leaf increases by 60 to 70%, because once we get to anthesis, the hormone signals in the head, once we get to anthesis, say no more root growth, you've done your job, we're going to recycle as much of the nutrient into the grain, which is the next generation, and we're going to sacrifice other plant parts if we have to. So something around 70 to 90% of your nitrogen uptake takes place after then. Your dry matter increases by 80%. So that's why that change from vegetative to it is important. So sampling when you've only got, you need to think about sampling, particularly for mobile nutrients. Sampling too early, particularly plant tissue sampling, in those early stages can be a bit of a concern, because you may be looking, not looking at what the crop's got available. So the plant roots are not to their full depth. They're not seeing all the nitrogen that's there. So if they're showing low nitrogen levels in the tissue, it could be just the location of the nitrogen, and it will grow out of it later. Now that's what you don't want to happen. You don't want the plant tissue to tell you one thing, in reality something else happen. So generally, when you're talking about plant tissue analysis for nitrogen and sulfur, think about where, or even have a dig around and think about how deep is the root system. And if I have plant tissue, if I have soil analysis, does the sampling match up with the soil, where the soil said the nitrogen should be? If the plants haven't reached it, don't sample. Wait a bit longer. So those dynamics need to be thought through when we talk about, what are we sampling and how are we making the decision. The other thing is the fate of nitrogen at various growth stages. So generally up to, unless we put on huge amounts, generally early we're talking on yield influence, and the later we go, we're talking more about protein influence. And the reason why, again, this Z30 to 37 stage is important is because we're having an effect on both. If you want to have less effect on yield and more on protein, you tend to head your targeted nitrogen through close to flag leaf. If you want to have more yield influence, then we head it back towards the first and second node stage. So as far as in-crop end budgets, the questions are, how deep do we go generally? When do I do it? Do I need to account for nitrogen already in the crop? And is N uptake efficiency post-establishment versus pre? Do I need to take that into account? So yes, nitrogen budgets can be done in crop, and there are quite a few people that do have a check on their nitrogen programs, particularly if they've lost track pre-plant and they want a little bit more time in autumn for mineralisation to happen. Really the mineral nitrogen pool by the time you sow is probably not going to change a lot for a probably 6 to 8 week period, other than for crop uptake. Once we get into spring and organic turnover kicks back in again, then we can start to see some changes. So how deep? Well, again, it really, for a crop end budget, it depends on what you know about the root growth. Generally, I would focus on the top 60 centimetres. In most seasons, that's where majority of nitrogen comes. If you want to know about what's below there, in case we end up with a season that tails out quickly, if you've got moisture below 60 centimetres, then down to 90 is probably a reasonable as a separate sample to understand what your options are for later in the season if the season starts to tap out. Generally up to Z30, doing nitrogen budgets after Z30, we start to get into problems with the amount of N in the dry matter. As it exponentially takes off, it starts to become very significant. So up to Z30 is usually the limit for in-crop budgets, accounting for N already in the crop. Generally up to probably mid-tillering, don't have to worry too much, and then budget's probably only as good as plus or minus 10 or 20% as far as the correct rate at the end of the season. It predicted plus or minus 20% of the right rate. But once we start to get towards the end of tillering, if you get from mid to late tillering, then we're starting to get to the zone in some of the growing areas where you do grow reasonable biomass prior to the tillering, so the end of tillering. Then we're starting to get to the range 20 to 60 kilograms of N already being in the crop by the time you do N budget. So that needs to be taken off the demand from there forward. So it's really about knowing about your location, and I'd say once you get above about 20 kilograms accumulation at the time, in the crop, at the time that you're going to do the end budget, you need to start thinking about possibly taking it off what the crop requires for the remainder. The uptake efficiency post-establishment versus pre, yes, a significant factor. And the more nitrogen we tend to put on in reliable climates in the Z30 to 37 stage, those efficiency factors of fertilizer go into the top end of what I described, the 20 to 60 range. It is not uncommon for very well planned nitrogen programs to have nitrogen efficiency, fertilizer nitrogen efficiencies of plus 60%. For in-crop applications, so in the right season. So they're the relevant factors. These are some of the defaults we have in SawMate for those that use SawMate. If you click the in-crop, these are some of the defaults that use. They can be overridden, but you can see we default at 3-leaf stage. Really, the nitrogen use efficiency that's in there is still down at at planting levels. It rises at first node to the 55 to 60, and then it drops away at the start of booting. So flag leaf, it's still up here and it starts to drop away if you want to do it later. Similar for canola. So there's some of the things that are actually in the SawMate nitrogen budget if you want to run it in crop. This is also in there, and it just shows you the increase. This one in particular, the red, is the increase in dry matter for a particular crop yield. So the N uptake and the N decrease in the actual the tissue level. So you can see over time with dilution, as the crop grows, the N in the tissue drops, but the accumulation increases. So one of the things, why we limit to some degree around Z30 is you can see this is realistically what happens. It changes that quickly that getting a fix at going from 40 kilograms through to 60 basically in a 2-week period. So that becomes hard to manage as to whether you use 40 or 60. So moving on, that's the crop budget. Everything else is basically the same other than needing to take into account those factors. Plant tissue, I call it asking the one that counts. Remember, the plant at the time that you take a tissue analysis is basically reflecting all the things that have happened to it prior to the day that you took the analysis. So, when we're talking about plant analysis, couple of things that always gets discussed is which plant part and when do I take it for what nutrients. Generally, I would say if you're going to do stuff early, you're probably going to be doing it for NPK, S, zinc. Nitrogen, as I said early, I'm not all that fussed on doing. I'd rather see that being left to later on in this stage. But certainly to know whether to put more nitrogen on, it's nice to know that it's adequate in all these other nutrients and they're not going to limit end response. Then the question becomes whole tops or YEBs. To me, if you're concentrating on the trace element side of things, youngest expanded blades are probably the better ones because they tend to be immobile in the plant and the deficiencies will show up there first. If you want to concentrate on the PKS side of things, or sorry, the PK side of things, then you're probably better off with whole tops because youngest expanded blades, because they are mobile within the plant, generally get favoured by, if there's any problems, redistribution from lower leaves. So that's the logic. If we come down to sampling rules, first you've got to know the limitations of interpretation criteria before sampling. Too often I see samples taken and people then come and say, okay, what's available to interpret this? It's the other way around. Know what you've got to interpret something before you go out and sample. Otherwise, you could end up with something that we end up trying to interpolate or extrapolate or just plain guess what it means. So the sampling protocol needs to be appropriate for the sampling data, which also means any extra data other than just the plant needs to be collected at the time. Understand the effect of crop conditions at sampling on results, and things in winter crops that continue to be issues are overcast, continued overcast conditions and frost. Anything that affects photosynthesis for more than 48 hours, then you're going to have to be careful of plant sampling after that. As far as spatial distribution, same rules as for soil. So if you've got an NDVI map that's telling you that there's something different in the paddock in dry matter, maybe using that to guide sampling is a good idea. Be aware of contamination. Remember they're perishable in transport, and remember in these days and age with wheat aphids and lupin diseases and those sort of things, biosecurity is pretty important when you're moving plant material around, either local, based on you wandering around crops or vehicles being driven near crops, and to the lab. Most labs have protocols in place to be able to receive things from interstate, but look out if something crops up around a new disease or something, because that may need to be taken into account. So when we're talking about whole tops or YEBs, as I said before, it really comes down to probably the statement that YEBs are better for immobile nutrients and whole tops for mobile nutrients. But we need to be careful of whole tops because they are very subject to dilution. So if we're using them for troubleshooting, then you're taking whole tops, one with a sample that's compromised in dry matter production and the other one that isn't, then it's frequently the one that's growing better seems to have lower concentrations. The other thing that we come across with plant samples, particularly for nitrogen, is people asking about what do the different nitrogen measurements mean. And we can, basically the nitrogen concentration that's in the plant is a balance between the nutrient storage compounds, which are basically amino acids, proteins, and those sort of things, and the current soil supply, which is nitrate and ammonium that comes up via the xylem, and any internal recycle, which is generally only the amino compounds. So we don't generally get recycling of, well, we don't get recycling of nitrate back through the plant. It only comes up through the xylem. So the nitrate is really a measure of the balance between the roots supply on any one day. So if the roots aren't supplying because it's dry, you can end up with low nitrate nitrogen, but you might have high total N. And the transformation of those organic compounds into organic compounds. And nitrate only, as I mentioned only flows in the xylem. So when you're looking at an N plant tissue test, you can look at it in a four-way matrix, basically the total N versus the nitrate N. So if we end up with both low, it means we've got low stores of functional N, these organic stores, and low soil nitrogen supply. And what that normally says is act now if there's no other limitation. It has run out, it doesn't have a good store of nitrogen, and it is running out of nitrogen. You would check that against any other conditions in the soil, but if there's no other reason, moisture's okay, there's been no other check to growing like daylight or amount of sunlight or frost or anything, this is an act immediately type scenario. So if you've got high total N and low N supply, that means we've got high stores due to past availability and either declining N supply or rapid metabolise of the current sources. So it's just not keeping up with in the leaf with the amount the plant's turning over. This is probably a wait and see and reassess a little bit later to see whether it's just a factor of the last couple of days growing conditions and it settles back out or not. But this is sort of a wait and see and maybe reassess later on. When we've got low total N and high nitrate, this can be a trigger that there's an environmental or internal nutrient stress causing the accumulation of soil nitrate N supply in the leaf, and it requires an investigate further. So this is go and have a look at your phosphorus, have a look at your sulfur, have a look at things like molybdenum, and check that there's something that is in the metabolism pathway that is used by the plant to convert or to accept nitrate from nitrate through to amino acids is not being blocked by a lack of supply. So sulfur is a common one where you see this. You end up with low N in the tissue, a high N to S ratio in the tissue, and very, very high nitrate. In a grazing crop, it pays to be very careful of this one because we can end up with nitrate toxicity in grazing livestock. So we've got both of them high, good stores of functional N and a soil supply, reassess at a later critical decision point. So if this is sort of, you're in Z30, 35, this is probably a good indication that the crop doesn't need too much more N unless there is a loss event or, again, a very significant change in the growing conditions for the better. So just a couple of things about knowing your interpretation information. This is a graph of what happens with N in whole tops across phenological stages. So you can see the worrying point here is where it's nearly dropping vertically. This is a plot, all of these different colors of different studies that have looked at the relationship between the adequate point for nitrogen in the plant versus growth stage. So, you can see around the Z30, it can be quite problematical to use whole tops because things are changing in concentration that rapidly that it's hard to get a good line on what's really happening as far as critical ranges. Once we get out here to, things start to brighten up a bit, and then they're pretty good, but that stage there, look out. Comparison, same graph with youngest expanded blade. You can see it doesn't suffer the same problem with whole tops. And this is a dilution function. The problem here is the crop is growing in dry matter that rapidly, and the concentration in the whole tops is dropping that rapidly. It becomes nearly impossible to interpret. Youngest expanded blade, different thing altogether. The plant naturally takes N from the bottom of the plant and stacks it up the top. As recycle if it's a bit short on supply. So this is looking at the overall supply versus consumption. You can see around that Z30 stage, quite stable, and a lot of the, I suppose not, and I call these continuous function interpretation processes where at any stage you can actually take a sample and interpret it. Whereas we have the lookup table type approach, which really is defined by plant part and crop stage. So, you know, most of the interpretation functions that are around are this single lookup status that would say at, you know, a range of Z24 to 30, this is the status range. Anything in 3 to 6 is okay, and below 1.5 is too low. You know, that's what we're really looking at, and that's what this is describing. These have some problems. This one, obviously, you have to make sure you take the right plant part at the right crop stage to be interpreting it. So if you've only got this for Z24 to 30, you sample earlier, this doesn't work. You sample later, it doesn't work. So if you're using this sort of interpretation, be very, very clear about what plant part and stage that you're taking. If you have continuous functions like this in your interpretation system, then you've still got to be careful what you use around Z30. If you're going to use whole tops, but expanded blades are available, then you've got a lot more option to determine across a larger range of time. The thing that this doesn't do is account for large differences in dry matter growth. So this particular system assumes that dry matter is normal for phenology. But if there is some sort of discrepancy between dry matter and phenology, then this doesn't work either, particularly the whole tops. You know, your youngest expanded blade, yep, you're probably really left with that if you've got a difference there. The other system that is emerging for this is what's called a nitrogen nutrient index, and which really looks at the dry matter versus the amount of nutrient in the crop, or the critical range, and it plots it over time. So for this system to work, you've actually got to get a measure of biomass and relate that to the N concentration in the actual biomass that was sampled. Now, this is a common system in Western Australia, but it's not used very much in Eastern Australia, and some recent research by Victor Sadras and his group would suggest in drier areas, this doesn't work all that well in the vegetative stages. But once we get through to the late tillering and into up to Z37, then this system will work reasonably well for nitrogen at this stage. So, you know what you're going to use to interpret it, because it really does determine whether you can interpret or not at a particular stage and for a particular plant part, and under particular conditions where you might have dilution factors. The last one I wanted to talk about was remote and paroxysmal sensiting. And I don't want to say too much, because there's sort of a lot going on in this space, and there's a lot of claims being made by a lot of people that can produce very pretty pictures like this one, which is coming out of our new Optera system. And this is just a plain NDVI for cropping paddocks. But you know, really, I think these are very useful tools, and probably a lot of effort's going into companies trying to ground truth these. I think, you know, at least at a couple of places in the season, there is still, it gives a great appreciation of variability within crops. But they're probably for a while, and probably the next 3 to 5 years, as we get used to these tools and we get an understanding of which ones work under what conditions, probably these are great tools to locate ground truthing sites for our typical type of analysis that we know has worked over time. So I'm not going to go into the benefits of whether you use GNDVI or red edge or chlorophyll density or all of those sort of things. They've all got their place, they've all got their claims, but I think the starting point with plant tissue is recognizing there is variability in crop density and possibly crop nitrogen, and using that to explore that, to see if there's any opportunities to better manage it in crop. So Chris, I've run a bit over there and into the chat session. So have we got some chats, or we can open it up?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I'll just grab the screen back. I've just got a couple of housekeeping points, a couple of quick points to make at the end of that. and I've got the group chat session there open. So if anybody wants to fire any questions through, just while I step through a couple of screens and a couple of things, just picking up on what Chris has spoken about. So just let me get back over here and get some screen sharing going again. And just have a quick run through a couple of things. So has that come up again, Chris?
Yes, those for me, thanks.
Excellent, righto. So just some key points, I guess. First thing is we've been recording the session today. So at the end of this, I'll go through and render it and then save it off. So we'll pop that into the news update next week. Email CD or I in the meantime if you want a copy of it beforehand. From that, just in terms of the work that we're doing, Chris just made mention to Optera before, there's an enormous amount of activity going on in terms of the way we reinvent the traditional way that we presented soil testing, plant tissue testing and so on. So one of the things that a lot of you may or may not be aware of is for all SoilMate users, you've got access to the Optera platform, and you'll see very shortly just the work that we're doing there and why you need to be able to do that. Part of that is the context of there's a new way of, there's a new version of SoilMate, if you like, and it's built into Optera. It's called FertRec. It was designed for high volume users and it's template driven. So the base is once you set up the template structures for the type of testing you do by crop type, variety, and so on, then it becomes a very rapid process to be able to process large volumes of tests. The next part around that is the work that we're doing in and around Optera mapping. So we're in QA and late stage testing now to roll out a number of initiatives for the end of autumn, being the end of May, to take us into crop management phase. And I'm going to give you a look at just a very quick look at two of those as we wind up. The context there is a lot of this stuff is driven from a spatial reference from the mapping basis, and it's activity driven. So one example of an activity is just an ability to create sample orders for tests. In the context of us rolling that into use, starting with in-crop end work and plant tissue samples this season. One of the things that's going to change a lot is, as I guess we reinvent our position in sort of crop nutrition and soil health, one of the things we can do is leverage a lot of the detailed status that sits in behind SoilMate traditionally, but repurpose it in different ways. So when you do a create an order from the map, you potentially will always select an ET or the basis of the model, and that makes things a lot easier at the other end. So once the tests process through the lab and you receive them by way of email advice, in selecting an ET, for example, when you're ordering, it'll automatically give you detailed status. So by crop type, variety, district, target yield, from which you can then determine fairly quickly and easily what crop nutrition or what advice you'll provide, and provide that fairly quickly from there without, in that instance, going anywhere near SoilMate as such. So I guess that all sort of rounds out around much easier access to results. So in the way that manifests, just some quick screens that are coming through. The testing basis is from a mapping perspective, all of the soil test results, historical soil test results, are automatically brought through and available. So that could be available on the fly as you're running around. That's obviously very detailed information that we needed to do in the first level of integration. And we're currently in the process of these red dots that indicate that there's a soil test available in a particular paddock for a particular year. The next iteration of that for the end of May gives you some selectable attributes around NPKS, pH, soil organic carbon ratio. So if you like, a rapid way of being able to see those monitoring results in that sense. So we burning the midnight oil to test that and get that ready for crop management this season. Just a quick screenshot I grabbed from there. There's still some what we call UI, user interface work to tidy this up, but that's the work that we've been doing. So you locate a sample point, a data point within a paddock where you wish to create a sample from, whether that's a plant tissue in this instance, and are able to drive the result in terms of the order, the actual purchase order and so on directly from there. That in turn works fairly closely with the basis of then, if you wish to, being able to create a 3 or a 5 zone, in that instance, a bit NMAP, but the notion of 3 or 5 zone simplified rapid zoning tool to be able to produce the shapefile directly from that would load into any modern controller. So the notion of variable rate in that sense, from an end application perspective, that particular integration is coming directly from our integration partner Data Farming in that instance. So they're the 3 quick things I wanted to just cover off just quickly. The broader work that Chris is doing is, as we build a capability that's very much spatially driven, there's an enormous amount of reference data available to us collectively around soil constraints. So I've chosen a tile there that comes from our work that's going on in northern Queensland for the Queensland Reef legislation, but the basis of being able to import as predefined layers a lot of the, and this is all regional DPI based mainly, content that exists. So, and we understand that that similar or same content exists right across Australia. So across the broader term out over the next 3 to 6 month window in terms of engineering, we're doing a lot of work to bring that through to you as well. And you can see there the different soil layers and how you might access that. Some of the challenges there are the resolution of the mapping at 1 is to 100,000 or 1 is to 50,000. Bringing that down at paddock level is a little challenging, and that's what's taking the time to resolve. If you're a long-term soilmate user, then there's a potential that you'll need to do some calibration, if you like, just in terms of farmer paddock naming between soilmate and the basis of the content that's already on Optera. If you've been a soilmate user only and wish to bring the content across so that it's all displayed in Optera, that's a pretty straightforward process, and we can assist you through that. Alrighty, so Chris, I'll just get back to the where's our chat screen? Just see if there is any questions there. And so Chris, can you see the chat screen? I'll just read the question. Interested in your opinion on why more of the market haven't incorporated urea inhibitors or nitrification inhibitors into fertilizer budgets in an effort to improve nutrient use efficiency. Do you think it comes down to cost, inconsistent agronomics? Do you have an opinion on those?
Yeah, look, I was lucky enough to get an invite to sit through the nitrogen, more profit from nitrogen, last week or the week before. And one of the large topics of research were obviously in looking forward in understanding nitrogen in various farming systems and farm segments in Australia is nitrogen use efficiency and how those enhanced efficiency products might work. If we're talking about grain, there would be appear to be some limited, well, it's basically unequivocal that the things actually reduce the production of nitrous oxide and greenhouse gases under conditions where that occurs. So that's a fact, and it can be quite significant. The hard part to reconcile, and it's still hard to reconcile, is that doesn't necessarily turn into an increased yield or the ability to significantly reduce the nitrogen input to cover the cost of the cost of the inhibitors. So yeah, you're right. The price of those things is not sufficiently low to be able to look at it as an insurance policy. And nothing's changed in the 40 or 50 years that I've been looking at nitrification inhibitors. The thing that you can't get around is it's like insurance. It's great when you need it, but the trouble is you've got to pay for it every year. And there's always that question, does the amount, am I better off keeping the money in my pocket over the 10 years that doesn't need it to, I suppose, to deliver some more nitrogen or to take a hit on yield in the year that it actually does work and makes a significant difference. And I think by and large, most of the studies are saying at this stage, the frequency of loss and the size of loss does not equal the cost of applying it every year. So you apply it for 10 years and you lose, and it works in two, the costs don't add up. Certainly in the year that you apply it and you lose a lot, then it adds up. But you do it in the long term, it doesn't.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris.
In other environments like sugar and like horticulture, they are being able to see benefits, but they are more extreme. Like in the sugar areas, there is at least everywhere in Australia where sugar's grown, that's right from the Clarence right through to Mossman in North Queensland, there are at least 3 significant waterlogging events every year. We could only wish that happened in the majority of the grain industry.
Alrighty, so Chris, we're running right onto time there. So I think with no further questions there in the group chat, we'll call that a wrap. But certainly in the update, you'll find CD's email there. So by all means, if there's any further questions or there's a bit of one-on-one stuff that you'd like, let's shoot those emails through and we'll keep the conversations going. So everybody, thank you very much for your time, your valuable time this morning. Trust you all got some value from that, and thank you for being online. Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Talk to you later.